We're connecting to, okay. There's an American recording us right now.
We're going to end up with Julian Assange in prison.
Yeah. So just, obviously just a brief introduction before I hand to Mark. So we've been thinking about this topic for a while, and so Mark's been working on sort of the structure for it. We had the kickoff this past Sunday. What we're quite encouraged at when Ken came. We often try not to give him too much information about what's going on, and just let his sort of gifting shine through his sort of prophetic words for us. And so it really aligns with what we were thinking from a completely different direction. So I think that really worked out well. His talk, which just happened to coincide with us kicking off this particular speaking thing. So I'm really expecting a lot of positive things here. Just sort of the technicalities. I've put up the roster. Hopefully everyone's been able to check that. We really only have 4 remaining Sundays to speak on the theme before we're into Christmas. The Christmas service being, I think, the 24th. So there's only sort of a short number of speaking topics. So please jump in quickly. There's really, I put myself down for the following week, so that there's only 2 more before we jump into Christmas. And then through the January, we're going to be doing kind of speaker's preference. We'll pause the theme because we really don't get great traction through those months. People just are away, but not those months, that month. And so we'll be kicking it off most likely first or second week in February. We'll come back to the theme. So we get just a short period to sort of do these first series, and then we'll have to come back to this in February. That makes sense? Okay, over to you, Mark.
Great. Okay. As Andrew says, we were sort of encouraged, the Ken factor. But also, this is sort of something that Ken had been, when I was in hospital in Italy, Ken had a word for me, and it involved something like this. And so I was sort of tossed it over my head. And then when we got back and we were thinking about the next theme, I turned to Andrew and I said, I think this is what it is. And he said, yeah, that's what I've been thinking too. So it seems to converge upon where we are. In some ways it's a difficult theme, because a lot of our themes to this point have been very sort of intellectual, very abstracted. They haven't required a lot of action. But I think if you think about what the purpose of this theme is, it really is the Lord trying to move us as a church to action. And so the question is, how do we integrate action with our teaching and our preaching, right? And we haven't tended to do that. We've tended to basically get up and Charles and I were talking about this a few months ago, about when Julia gets up and does her famous summary, you realize exactly how much content you've covered. It's quite remarkable, and yet we've sort of repeated nothing in a sense, and we just keep drawing out of the well. And so there's a good indicator. I think the Lord's in it. Good indicator too of the inspiration of the word. So there's a thing to think about as we talk about the theme, and that is, how am I going to make this practical? How am I going to send people away with a challenge? How am I going to engage the facticity of what it is Jesus is doing? Rather than just sort of download thought. And that's the difficult thing. I think the teachers are in the room are probably used to being challenged to do this. That is, follow up, have a theme, provide content, provide a challenge, follow up the challenge, and try to get people to reflect and to integrate their experiential learning, which is literally what Jesus does in these passages between Luke 8 and 10. That essentially, it's Jesus sending the disciples out to learn to do his ministry, because, as he says to them, the Son of Man must be lifted up, and on the third day he'll rise again. And so he's constantly telling him, I'm on my way to Jerusalem, and I'm going to be crucified. And the disciples try to gloss it, and the reason they try to, in a sense, come to a different interpretation of what he's saying to them, and why Jesus has to keep repeating it to them, is because fundamentally there's something the disciples have to do, that they have to learn. They can't just continue to be hearers of the word. They have to learn to be doers of the word. And so these 3 chapters are fundamentally one message about Jesus trying to move his disciples from being hearers and interpreters of parables and to becoming doers who come back to him. And then at the end, he there's this sort of the famous story about the Good Samaritan, where Jesus is talking to the Sadducees, and he says, who amongst these, the priest, the Samaritan, the merchant, who amongst these was doing the will of God? And the Sadducees will say, well, the Samaritan. And Jesus just turns to them and says, go and do likewise. Now, the go and do likewise thing is sort of interesting, because he's not just saying go and be nice to people when you find them in a ditch. But what he's saying is go and do as your mouth has proclaimed. Jesus often says, as you say, right? Instead of trying to get people to sort of give people a big dump of information, he's always trying to get them to answer the question and to express their own conviction. And in this case, it's the same with the Sadducees, because he's saying to them, you go and do likewise. That is, go and do what you yourself proclaim to be the thing which is good, which is godly, which is righteous. And because otherwise you end up judging yourself. And there's that sort of, you think about the larger picture where Jesus says, the Son of Man is, in a sense, given the right to judge, right? And the long arc of history will lead to judgment. But he also says that in his time upon earth, he says, I do not come to judge anyone, right? He says both things, right? He also says things like, and there's these 2 opposing verses. One where he says, where the disciples come back to him and say, Master, people have been wandering around healing in your name, and should we stop them? And Jesus said on one occasion, he says, no, leave them, because anyone who is doing the work of the Father is one of us. And then on another occasion, he says, no, anyone who doesn't know me, is my enemy. And you think, how can those 2 things be held in tension? And the whole thing therefore rotates around not the head knowledge stuff, but the ability to imbibe the life of Christ and actually to do the work of God. So that, so what looks like externally exactly the same thing can in fact internally be quite different. Because you think about what this teaches us in terms of the work of God, that we concentrate on the externals a great deal. We focus on, behavior, dress, moral codes, all sorts of things. We impose those upon our people. But you think about God's plan of redemption, he imposes almost none of those upon anyone. Almost all of the work that God does in the plan of redemption is not pillars of fire and 10,000 angels, as Jesus says he could have called upon. But it's an internal work whereby the people he has made in the beginning are remade through the process of remaking the world, right? It's an internal process. God doesn't build from the outside in, he builds from the inside out. That's the plan of redemption. But because he knows this, that in the end, we are redeemed partially by being participants in the plan of redemption. So that is something to hold in your head. And there are some things which you can only learn by doing. They're not things you can read about in a book. They're not things which people can teach you by telling you to do something. You can only learn them if you go and actually do it. And you think about like somebody who's read a book about, fixing cars, right? well, it might be good, but as soon as you get the oil on your hands and you end up with a slightly different car, then all that learning goes out the window, doesn't it? In other words, there has to be there's a pragmatic way of knowing. In the ancient world, the Greeks had this distinction, between techne, which is the art, which is learning by doing, like the knowledge of skills and capacity, as opposed to what the Romans called ars, which is the holistic way of knowing through philosophy. So it's the way of abstraction as opposed to the way of becoming involved in the thing itself. Greeks were famously, like Aristotle at one stage, refused to actually look at the stars as a way of trying to understand the cosmos, because the stars were accidental things. They were not things in themselves. They were just expressions of things. And so he never thought that it was his job to actually go and act like a scientist, go and observe, aggregate data, and tell us what that means about the theory that you had when you first came to observe, right? That's the sort of scientific method. But the Greeks didn't think like that. The Greeks thought, well, okay, we detach ourselves from the world, we think through pure logic and pure thought, and we come up with theories about the world, which can only really be gainsaid through the arguments of other people who've done exactly the same sort of process. And so you end up with these philosophy wars between Democritus and Epictetus and Socrates and Plato, and the wars between the sophists and the followers of Plato in the academy, which are sort of the framework for Greek philosophy. Hebrews, on the other hand, tended to have a more applied way of approaching coming to know things, and that was through this approach of the master and the disciple, and that you followed the master around, you participated with the master in what the master did, you served the master, you observed the life of the master, and in a sense, the life of the master became yours. So Jesus at one stage says, that a student is never greater than his master. He doesn't say that he can't be like his master. He says he can never be greater than his master, because the reason for that is because it's the life of the master that you're trying to emulate and imbibe. So Jews understand this. It's a pragmatic thing, and quite often, in rabbinical education, rabbis were taught both a secular skill and a sacred skill. The sacred skill was the interpretation of text and argument, and the secular skill was how you survived. So you learnt carpentry, and you also sat in shul or so that you could read in synagogue and interpret the text. So we have scenes of that in the New Testament, don't we, where Jesus goes up to the synagogue and somebody opens the word to the prophet Isaiah and asks Jesus to read it, because any adult male Jew can read and speak from the text in synagogue. I mean, synagogue is defined by, in the rabbinical sense, not the temple, which is different, but the synagogues are defined by the gathering of 10 adult males, right, who are believers, who are circumcised believers, and who are children of the commandment. So that's literally what Jesus is doing in the synagogue. He said, and then he closes the book, and he says, "This day in your hearing, this prophecy in this text has been fulfilled." All right. Now that's Jesus being the master, right? And what he's doing is inviting people to become his disciples. And we see that in the very beginning of the gospel, don't we? Where Jesus, it says after his baptism under John says to him, it should be me who is being baptized by you, not you who's being baptized by me, right? That's a master disciple thing, right? And then Jesus says, no, let it be for now, because I need to fulfill all righteousness. That is, Jesus needs to go through and actually fulfill all the steps of prophecy so that people would recognize that the Messiah had come. He never tells them he's Messiah, but he gives them all the clues, right? That anybody who is a believing Jew and actually understands the Old Testament is sitting around waiting for these sorts of signs. So, and then Jesus goes off, and the very first thing he does is he calls his disciples. He walks along the Sea of Galilee, and he calls Andrew, and Andrew runs away, and he calls Peter, and then Nathaniel, and he aggregates them over time, and they volunteer to become his disciples. The whole point of that, and of their walking with him for 3 years, is so that they can observe his life, not just his teaching. They can become like him, not greater than him, but to become like him. And every now and again, you come across people in the New Testament who, like Hillel or Gamaliel or Shuai or some of the other rabbis who are the key teachers at the time. So Jesus, in a sense, fits into that category in the Jewish mind. But then Jesus is always, as he does in these 3 chapters, he's always challenging people by saying, well, who do people say I am? And occasionally he'll say, well, you read this in the Old Testament, but one who is greater than David has come, one who is greater than Elijah has come, and he keeps pointing them towards the time. The time is the time of the Messiah. Okay, so all of that is the context in the sense of what's happening. At some stage, however, disciples have to grow up. They have to stop being followers because the master will pass on, and they have to live the life of the master and themselves become masters and have disciples, right? And that's what we see here in Luke 8 through to 10. So I think I can share screen, can I not? I think I can. All right, so this is the text which Andrew sent you the link for. It's the theme overview, and it comes from Luke 10:37, as you'll see, the statements to the Sadducees. So it's not terribly complimentary. So when people are told to go and do likewise, they're being made the equivalent of Sadducees, which they won't like very much. But anyway, the story of, however, is preceded. The context of the story of the Good Samaritan is preceded by Jesus sending out the 12, which he does in Luke 8, and that comes before the sending of the 72, which is linked to Luke by Luke to indicate that Jesus is going to continue to build in outwardly expanding rings. What he does is he starts with Peter and John, and goes up the mountain. Then he sends the disciples out, and then he sends the 72 out, and so you've got these concentric rings of Jesus equipping the community. And then at the end, of course, what you've got is the book of Acts, where all the believers are baptized in the Holy Spirit, and you have this Jesus revolution which goes out into the world. So the whole idea here is that we're expected to go and multiply and to do the work of the Father, and that's precisely the commandment which is given in I think it's Mark 28. Jesus, in these texts, Jesus feeds the 5,000, and then they come to him and they say, well, how we're a long way from shops. There's no coals around here. What do we do? And Jesus says, you give them something to eat, because he's just sent out the disciples. They've gone out and they've preached, and they've healed people, and they've cast out demons. And then they come back and they're watching Jesus teach these 5,000 people. And Jesus says, and yet all of a sudden they're incapable again. In one moment, they're fulfilling the role of the disciple by living the life of the master, by healing and preaching and casting out demons, all of which are also happen in broader Jewish expressions, particularly, and continue to happen in contemporary Jewish expressions amongst the Hasidim in Eastern Europe, for example. They use this model a great deal. But then when they come back to him and they've got these 5,000 people, suddenly they're weak again. And so what's the gig? Well, what Jesus doesn't turn to them and say, well, just leave it to me, I'll look after it. He says, you give them something to eat. And so the work of the Father is typified by having little available in terms of resources. But he turns to them, he says, what do you have in your hand? And that's where he has the story about the 2 fish and the 5 loaves. And so so at that point, he says, there's no need to ask for more. What we're expected to do can be started on what we already have. And what we need further will come when we step out and we follow his command. So I think Charlie's speaking on only believe next week, right? In this case, you see this issue, right? In one case, the 12 are out there and they're believing, they're doing what Jesus told them to do. But when they come to a situation they don't understand, suddenly they're all at sea. What do I do? And Jesus says, well, you give them something to eat. Why don't you? Because it's the very same faith. It's not a different faith. It's not a series of techniques that Jesus is trying to teach them. What he's trying to teach them to do is to live in faith the life that God has poured out into the world, because that life heals, that life casts out darkness, that life is expressed through the preaching of the word and the coming of the kingdom, because the preaching of the word is about the coming of the kingdom. And then Peter is aside, he goes aside with Jesus, and Peter, he declares that Jesus is the Messiah, and that works because Peter finally realizes who Jesus is, and Jesus tells him elsewhere that his realization is not of himself or of man, but from the Father, who has spoken through his experiences. Now, the interesting thing here, of course, is that Peter then later on goes on and denies Jesus 3 times. So same story, right? Hero to zero, right? And then from zero to hero. The consequence is that once Peter makes that declaration, then he's left with no further excuse for not doing what Jesus tells him to do. And that's why his later denial of Jesus has such power, is because he's already declared that Jesus is the Messiah to Jesus himself. And so when he denies Jesus 3 times, he's in the same situation as the Sadducees. He's condemned by his own mouth, right? So you see this process. It's a very common process in the New Testament, where Jesus just lets people hang themselves, right? And yet when they come to the point, and this is a very typical Socratean teaching approach, right? Where Socrates just asks questions, and if you read the Timaeus, for example, or any of his approaches to teaching with people, he'll ask people questions until they begin to realize that what they believed and their ability to answer questions has been totally undermined by their own understandings. Right? So, and Jesus does exactly the same thing, except for the point for Jesus is not so the philosophical understanding of the world as it is with Socrates, or the good life. It is the life of God. So it's quite a different thing. So that's the work. So for this work, Jesus doesn't require highly gifted, charismatic individuals, right? And in fact, I think the history of the church is you let highly gifted, charismatic individuals run things, and everybody basically downs tools and sits down and watches them do things. And then eventually they burn themselves out. Case in point, not too far from here. So Jesus is trying to say to them, this is not about your personal charisma. This is not about your personal giftedness. This is about the life of God being poured out into the world, which is the word, right? I mean, that's what Genesis 1 tells us, that the redemption of the world is the life of God being poured out into the world, so that the world can become what it was always intended to be. And the way Jesus does that is by, in a sense, leading people into situations where who they are becomes apparent to them. I mean, you can express with your mouth that, say, you're a Christian or a follower of Jesus, but when it comes to the point, right, when it comes to the moment when you're given the opportunity to speak to someone about him, or to pray for someone for healing, or to be present with somebody with the life that Jesus has given you, what will you be? That's the test, right? And then Jesus predicts his death twice in the same chapter. He wants his disciples to know that, well, everything has a time, guys. We can't keep running around the block on this. There has to be a moment of crisis when you realize that the master won't be with you. He says at one stage, let us work while the day is with us, because the night comes when no one can work, right? So the clock's ticking for the crucifixion. Jesus knows exactly what time it is. Most of us have no idea what time it is. Most people get to their deathbed and go, "Gee, I wish I hadn't spent so much time at work. I wish I'd spent more time, doing the things that are important." Well, Jesus has none of that illusion. He knows precisely what time it is, because it's marked out by the prophetic pathway in the Old Testament, which he's following all the way along. And that's the turning point for the crucifixion, is the turning point in history for the empowerment of believers to witness to the work of the Father. So there's a sense in which every human has a daytime in which we can work before the night comes. And as we get older, we can realize that the day is actually a bit shorter than we thought it was. And so that's the parable of the workers that Jesus, the workers come, the master gives them work in the field. Then some other workers come later on, he hires them. Then some other workers come along and he hires them. And then, the first workers get upset because everyone gets paid a denarius. And the parable is, of course, that we are not paid according to our work. We're paid according to the master's need, right? So then and also, you know, Jesus says precisely after that parable, which is again in the same model, that, you know, wasn't a denarius good enough for you when you took the contract? How come you want to change your mind now because somebody only worked half a day? You know, so in other words, you know, it's the hypocrisy of humans which covers, and this is all of us. It's not just some of us. It's the hypocrisy of us humans, which drives a wedge between our ability to not just believe but to do and to be and to live the life which the Father is pouring out into the world for the redemption of creation. So Jesus, he predicts his death, and then you've got the story of the Transfiguration, which is that story alone. You could spend a week on that. So Jesus declares his belief in Jesus as the Messiah. This is when Peter, James, and John go up to the top of the mountain, and they see Jesus, and there's Moses and Elijah. And so, and Moses and Elijah appear side by side with Jesus, and they're talking to him. And so, the point of this is that now Jesus there's no veil between the disciples who are looking, the three, and their understanding of who Jesus is. They should be able to look at this now pretty clearly and understand, you know, if this guy in this bright, shining, cloak, and two other guys turn up who are clearly Moses and Elijah, these are the two great witnesses to the coming of the Messiah, habitually, right, in terms of Jewish interpretation of the Old Testament. Well, it should be pretty darn clear who Jesus is, right? But, you know, Peter immediately comes to the wrong conclusion. He says, "Oh, I should make, you know, it's the festival of shelters, you know, which by the way was what it was when on October the 7th when Israel was invaded. Let me come up with, let me build 3 tabernacles, one for each of you," as if Elijah, Moses, and Jesus were on the same level, as if in a sense they are prophets, you know, equally. So Peter comes to exactly the wrong conclusion. And so Moses and Elijah appear in glorious splendor. They talk about his departure, which is to bring fulfillment to Jerusalem. Peter and his companions are sleepy, but then they become fully awake. That is, they see his glory. And there's a sort of parable in this, that what is happening in this case is that Jesus is calling them to be fully awake. You know, that is, for them to truly understand what's going on. But it's very clear that even at that point, Peter doesn't really quite get it, even though he says, you know, "You are the Messiah." Well, what does that mean? Then they come down from the mountain, and then Jesus heals a demonically possessed boy who thrashes around, falls into the fire, and all that sort of stuff. And the father appeals to them, you know, "Master, can you not heal my son? Because your disciples tried and they failed." And so Jesus uses that situation to teach them about faith, fasting, and their own limitations. That essentially, again, you know, as soon as Jesus steps out of the picture, you know, everything he'd taught them, everything they've just done, they've been off preaching, you know, the word, healing people and casting out demons. Yet suddenly Jesus is like up the mountain with Peter, James, and John, and suddenly they're incapable again. What happens? Well, yeah, so clearly keeps it. So you get this cycle, and this cycle is the thing that unites these 3 chapters. It's basically Jesus says something, they go off and do it, they come back and they say, "Oh, well, we did this thing," and then Jesus puts them into another situation where they totally fail. And then so their lack of understanding is constantly brought back to them. And then there's opposition arises to Jesus. He teaches us that those who work for him will face trouble and opposition of the world. And he says that in Matthew 5, "Blessed are you when people insult you." I mean, we all like the first part of the Sermon on the Mount. We don't like the next bit, and the next bit which says, you know, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil things against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So it's the denarius for the day's work is going to be quite disappointing for people who are working for the denarius, because the consequences of being a Christian in the world are not glory now. They might be later, but the consequences of being a Christian in this world is that you're going to face all kinds of persecution. And then Jesus lays out the cost of discipleship. No one who puts his, he says in verse 62, in Matthew 5, no one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God. And so consequently, that's a footnote to the unity of these three chapters, right? That constantly the disciples are put in a situation where to do the things that they've been taught, and then they fail, and then they come back and they're desperate, and then Jesus teaches them the lesson of their failure, and then he says, now go out and try it again, feed the 5,000, do this, raise the dead, blah blah blah, cast out demons. And so it's that cycle, this teaching cycle, but the cycle is taught not through mere theory, but through practice. That is, go out, try what you've learned, fail, learn from your failure, come back and tell me what it is what was good about what you thought and what was not so good about what you thought, right? So the exercise of what Jesus is trying to get them to do drives them to deeper understanding. And all of that brings you to Luke 10, where having shown his disciples who he is, what the work was, what the cost was, he now sends out the 72 into the world. And here Jesus is convincing those who were against him. So the expert in the law says, Jesus says, which one of these guys was the righteous one? The expert in the law says, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. So this is the challenge that God faces in the church, not to get us to believe, right? Most people who turn up on Sunday believe, right? They believe in a series of propositions about Jesus. Did Jesus really exist? Yes, he did. Did Jesus, rise from the dead? Yes, he did. Is Jesus the Son of God? Yes, he did. People tick the boxes. But when it comes down to actual experience in the world, when you come to the time and the moment, which is redemptive, who will you be? Which Peter will you be? Which of the 12 will you be? Which of the 72 will you be? So much of what happens to us, that is the encounters on the mountain, the move of the Spirit, our experiences, good and bad, all of those are really about the Spirit getting us to do what Jesus intends to do through his teaching, and that is to get us not only to believe in a theoretical sense, in the Greek sense, but to be and to do the work of God. And then basically I'll give you a whole bunch of points in Luke 10, any of which could be a preaching theme, some of which I've turned into preaching themes. But feel free to dip the ladle into this list. So this idea of the first thing we should not misunderstand is the degree to which who and what we are sets us against God's will. That really most of us, even the best of us, a bit like I was saying on Sunday, why do scam calls work? Because we're all greedy. we're all corrupt in one way or another, and so a scammer will always find your weak point and manipulate that to use it against you, which is what Paul talks about in terms of the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. So everybody has these things. You control them, you live with them, you try and, as Paul told us about Jesus, he was tempted in all things, but he did not sin. To be tempted, it needs to be possible for you to sin, right? There is something in the human nature, and a lot of it comes down. It's an unexpected thing, right? The thing that causes us to sin is not because we want to be evil. Usually, it's because we want to be good. But our ability to conceptualize what good is leads us to do evil, because we participate and we capture it in a bubble. We write it down. We turn it into a creed. We teach it in church. Blah blah blah. That this is what good is, right? And Jesus turns to us and says, "Well, no one is good but God." In other words, our conception of goodness is never going to be enough. And that's the thing that causes most of us to fail. Because ultimately we try to judge with our own reason and our own conception of the world. And we forget that the goodness which God is inconceivable to us. It is self-referential, it is eternal, it is omnipresent, it is all-powerful. All of things which are categories which our minds can't conceptualize. And yet we try and conceptualize it by turning it into laws and guidelines and expectations, and whether or not you should wear a hat on stage or whatever. So might happen in another church near us. So therefore, part of the reason why Jesus takes the approach to teaching that he does is that he has to often short circuit our heads, because our heads, if you're a Jewish male, like in his time, by the time you are age 13, you need to be able to recite the first 5 books of the Torah, and you need to know the teaching of the law and the prophets. So there's not too many people, at least too many people who've been through Bar Mitzvah, who are not 500 times more capable in biblical literature than the average person in our own time is, right? And frankly, most of the people who sit in churches. So Jesus knows that part about the issue that we have is our brains, right? And our reliance upon our own reason and our own logic. And so he has to get us there in ways we don't expect. And so he will constantly rub us up against things, like give us a smack around the ear. And then you wake up in the morning, you go, I could have done that better. And so the call then is not to sit there and feel miserable about yourself or condemned, but to learn what it is you're being taught, right? Hopefully before you damage too many people in the process, right? So and that's the context for him sending out the 72. Go and preach the coming of the kingdom, is what he tells them. Go and heal the sick, and go and cast out demons. So these are all the things which typically a prophet could do in messianic expectations at the time. And there were other people later on, famously in the 19th century, Sabbatai Zvi, who was supposed to be the Jewish Messiah who came in the 19th century, in the 1840s, ended up leading a rebellion, got himself killed by the Polish authorities. That happens very regularly in the history of Judaism because of messianic expectation. And then people say, oh, he might be the one. And then people say, yeah, well, I might be the one. Oh, hey, actually, I am the one. Hey, heck, what the heck, And then, so Jesus is he teaches more through failure than he does through people getting things right. So go out, try these things, and they come back and they say to him, wow, it was amazing. We saw people healed, we saw demons being cast out, and Jesus said, well, that's good. He says, yeah, but I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. So compare your experience to this. Okay, and he doesn't pat them on the back and say you've done well. He says to them, you're only now getting a very small view of the cosmos within you, which you live, and what the real issue is. And that is, it is God taking back his kingdom. And you're you're participating in that, right? So why do we get these pictures from Luke and others, about the Good Samaritan, and why does Jesus talk in parables? Well, it's a way that Jesus has of theologizing their actions, right? So what Jesus is doing is creating a cultural space. Like when he talks from the mountain, like the Sermon on the Mount, which is not a very tall mountain, but anyway, he's not talking to everybody, right? There are lots of people there, but the first part of that passage is Jesus sat down, opened his mouth, and began to teach his disciples. And then there were lots of other people there. Almost everything he's doing is really for his disciples. He's not making grand statements to everybody. What he's trying to do is use experience and their encounter with the world, partially, which is all these people that are hanging around, to help them theologize their actions. That is, to not go from theory to practice, but to go theory, practice, back to theory, practice, back to theory, practice, back to theory, practice, so that you end up with a whole view of the world, not just theoretical precepts, you know, a la the person we were talking about before, Andrew, you know, or on the other hand, just things that are pragmatic and which work, right? If you get an opportunity, there's an interview with Ayaan Hirsi Ali. I don't know if you know who she is, but she was a Somalian refugee who joined the Muslim Brotherhood. Went to Saudi Arabia. She, you know, all sorts of horrible things happened to her. Anyway, she escaped to the Netherlands, became one of the new, what they call the new atheists. Well, it turns out, like last week, she said, "Well, I think I've become a Christian." But then you listen to her talking about being a Christian and what she thinks Christianity is that view of the world which gave us democracy, liberal institutions, education, science, the Western way of life, right? But at one moment she sort of sits there. This is on a series called Unheard, and the guy's interviewing, and he's saying, "Well, how did you get there?" She says, and she starts off by saying, "Well, I read Tom Holland's book, you know, which everybody should read, you know, how Christianity is basically responsible for everything that's good in Western culture, not just the things that are bad." She said she read this book, but the thing that got her was the fact that she had, having, in a sense, become an atheist, she felt an absolute spiritual vacuum. And she turned to alcohol and a whole bunch of other things. And she's Neil Ferguson's wife, by the way. I don't know if anybody knows Neil Ferguson, but he's probably, you know, the leading conservative historian in the world. Mind you, Mima has a story about him, which is not so good. So she tells this story, and you can sort of see that she's found this by coming into the Western world. She's found this better way of living. And she understands that if you cut that way of living off from its Christian roots, it's going to die, right? And so she's all now charging ahead for you know, the intellectual basis for Western culture on the basis of Christianity. The problem is she doesn't believe in any of the stuff which Jesus tells the disciples to go and do. She doesn't believe in tongues. She doesn't believe in healing. She doesn't believe in demons. She doesn't believe. She believes in evil. She's seen it. It's, you know, Hezbollah. You know, but you know, so this is a really interesting realization for her, because she ends up by saying, you know, I believe that God. Don't believe that God is some sort of external guy on a cloud with a beard, but he is some principle within us, right? And she sort of sees it. She's almost there, you know. But she's come at it backwards. She's seen the principles and then tried to deduce the God who explains the principles, and she's come up with this idea that God has to somehow live within us, and that, you know, that if she did this exercise where she sat down and she wrote out all the things which a God should be, and then she realized that person was Jesus. So she has this sort of intellectual understanding of the world, but she has no idea what it is that God's actually doing. Now, this is quite different, right? You know, it's one thing to be a believer and to come to an understanding of the intellectual necessity of the faith and of the explanatory power of the gospel for the way the world is and the way the world will be and where it's going. It's one thing to be that, and I think lots of Christians are that, you know, and I think at some stage all of us have been that, you know. It's quite another thing to be a participant with God in that redemptive plan, and to you know, to be present when Jesus does something, you know, in a significant way, you know. But if you talk to most people and you say to them, you know, does God have a plan for your life? They'll all say, oh yeah, absolutely, I believe, you know, God's got a plan for my life. That was very 1980s theology. Many people can tell you even what it is. And the problem is that Jesus never talks like that. And neither do any of the disciples. They could give a hoot what God's plan for your life is. The question is not that at all. The question is, how do we participate in the life of God, which is operating according to his plan for redeeming the creation? And that's quite a different set of questions, right? And the difference is that people in one world, that is, what is God's plan for my life, they end up with this sort of therapeutic view of God, that God is really about healing me, making my life good, giving me what I want. Whereas on the other hand, I don't think you see that anywhere in the New Testament. You know, when Jesus goes for the throat with his disciples, it's pretty brutal. You know, he's basically saying, well, this has nothing to do with you guys. You know, this is not about you or what you need. Take no script for the journey. Take no staff. You know, don't take any money or any food. Just take with what you've got on the back and go out and participate with God and see that God will supply all your needs while you are participating with him in the work of the life that he's pouring out into the world. But it won't necessarily be what you want, you know. And so that tells us why Jesus turns, you know, the hard sayings where Jesus turns to somebody who says, you know, but Master, I want to follow you. How do I do that? And he says, well, lay down everything you've got, come and follow me. And the young man says, well, I just need to go back and bury my father. And he said, well, let the dead bury the dead. That's a really hard saying, but you get what he means, right? That these two things are not the same thing. You know, that me wanting spiritual fulfillment isn't necessarily what God is doing in the world. And that's how he teaches them through this. He puts them into situations where all of their spiritual conceptions, their theological conceptions fail. And then he pulls them out the other side and says, now go and do this, right? And then try it, you know, understanding, you know, in the middle of that, he says, you know, who do people say I am? You know, well, you're not Elijah. Yeah, you're not just a prophet. You are the Messiah. But what does that mean? Well, you are the Son of God. Right? In other words, this is about the life of God being poured into the world. So, so if you work through those 3 chapters and read them as one story, one educational story for the disciples to participate in the life of the Master and in his mission, then I think you come to understand how each of the bits, the preaching points hang together. So that was basically the notes for this week. Essentially, next week is just believe, which is Luke 8:40-48. So, and that's really interesting because, if you think about that, I mean, Charles, you've obviously started to think about this. I mean, microphone.
Yeah.
Okay, so in that context, I mean, how are you going to interpret this passage?
Well, this is a test.
It's not a test, no. Mind you, if I was being Jesus at this point, this is where oh no, you're all wrong.
Yeah. Well, what I'm looking at is the key phrases there, where the woman, when Jesus finally concludes with it and says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well," and then when Jairus, Jesus said to Jairus, "Do not fear, simply believe." And those are the key words or key phrases that Jesus says. And it's all about, as you said, faith in action. How the 2 different types of faith that the woman had. I mean, Jesus had to do nothing, basically. She did it all. It was his power was drawn out of her. His power was drawn out of him into her healing, whereas Jesus had to go to the woman and the young girl and touch her in order for her to be healed.
Yeah, because Jairus comes and invites him to his home.
Yeah.
The other situation, the Roman soldier says, I'm a soldier, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, those 2 things, and when you put those alongside each other, the woman who has faith and great need, who desperately leans on God, Jairus, who's pretty well off, obviously, but doesn't have the faith he needs Jesus to come to his house, and then the guy who believes in the principle of things, like the soldier says, well, I'm a man who's used to being under command, just say the word.
Mm.
And in that moment, his servant was healed. And so you lay those three stories alongside each other, and you understand that what Jesus is partially trying to teach the disciples is it doesn't matter how much faith you've got. Isn't that funny, right? Because you could read that, if you read that story in isolation, right? Oh, that the woman had faith. All I need to do is have faith. Oh, my faith is not simple enough. Okay, so I'll go and read a seminar series, and I'll come back and learn to have simple faith, right? In fact, there's a really good song to that effect. Yeah, and simple. So we keep thinking it's about the technique. It's not about the technique. It's about, take no script, take no money, no staff for the journey. It's throw yourself into the life of God. And there is power there, regardless of how big your faith is, so to speak. And you think that's quite radical, because you're also given these other stories where Jesus heals, and it's pretty clear that the people are approaching it from quite different aspects of types of faith. Right?
I read somewhere also that most of the actions of Jesus were not to people of religious conviction.
Yeah.
They did not even have a relationship with Jesus until they were healed.
Yeah.
So and they got their salvation, as we call it today, after they received the miracle from Jesus, whether it be healing or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
So we tend to be today, come to Jesus and you will be healed. Accept Jesus and then you will be healed. Whereas here it's almost different. The healing comes first and their salvation comes afterwards.
So then that raises the whole issue about these signs that follow, right? And what their purpose is. And Jesus always, they're signs of the kingdom. That when the kingdom comes into a place, that's what happens. Wholeness returns, darkness recedes. But that, in a sense, not the point, is it really? You can be Benny Hinn if you like, but it's sort of not really the point. Unless people, as you say, Charles, understand that it's about the coming of the kingdom and the identity of Jesus. So, Andrew, you thought about, probably a bit far down the track for you being a sort of a Saturday night bandit, but Luke 9. Have you sort of given some thought about that?
Oh, so not a great deal. No, I'm still kind of chewing a little bit on it. I don't really have a kind of an angle right now. That's interesting. The sign, right, that the testimony is the key, and the witness is the power and authority, right? That's I really haven't kind of clearly got my head around it, but it's something intriguing there.
Well, it's interesting. You think about all the things we've learnt over the years, or been taught over the years, most of which have not been terribly useful, usually because they're attached to some other structure, like the pastor prays for people, or the evangelist comes and he's got the gift of healing, whatever, and that's nowhere to be found really in the New Testament, except in those two gift lists that Paul talks about. And then he's very distinct about the difference between the gift of healing and faith for healing, and those two things are quite different. Clearly what Jesus is trying to do with the disciples here is teach them about faith for healing, faith to see the kingdom present, right? I think the key verse is actually, I keep going back to Revelations 1 and 2, where Jesus stands amongst the candlesticks, right? The whole point is to get Jesus to get the king to come, right? And all the rest is about clearing the ground. The sower goes forth to sow. Well, what do you need? You need good ground, right? And so healing, casting out demons, etc., is about preparing the ground, and then the word falls into the ground and prospers and produces 1,000-fold. So I think the metaphor is a really powerful one. and this idea of the nature of the evidence which is required. I mean, how do people come to believe if almost everything about the kingdom is counter to the logic of the world? That's a big question, and how much of that is in our heads, right? I mean, and then week 4, which is the answer to that question: take nothing for the journey. Right?
I'm doing that one, Mark.
Lucky you.
Take nothing. I've got a question. Is
Yep.
there another week where there will be the 72? Because I don't want to overlap. I don't want to take anything from somebody else.
I think you probably have to reference the fact that Jesus does this twice, and it's not Luke filling out the story with the interesting bits. It's actually like it is 8, 9, and 10 operating as a whole process. So like this sort of outward expansion of the kingdom, right? So I think you can reference it, but the first one, which is where the disciples are sent out 2 by 2, then that clearly provides the model for what happens later.
Right.
Yeah, and is a sort of a prelude to the Book of Acts, right?
Mark, do we have access to this document? Because I
Yeah,
I
and
don't have access to it.
I think Andrew
Yeah,
said,
I should have shared it with you. I'll double check, Mia.
Okay.
It should have been on this discussion. Did you try and access it and then it like failed?
On the WhatsApp you're talking about?
Yeah.
Mia's not on this
All right.
for some reason. It's in that folder, but which you
Yeah.
should have access to, but for some reason you're not on. What's your
Okay.
Mia?
Just Mia Rosillo Gmail. It should come up. Yep, that first one. No, yep. Thank you.
No worries. Cool. All right. Any questions? Okay. Well, the important thing I think is to treat the 3 chapters as one thing, one big block, and avoid the tendency which you see in the NIV and others, because they tend to put headings in for every different section. You got to remember the headings aren't in the original. So you can tend to read particularly if you're using an English Bible, the sections are separate from one another. But when Jesus does this with the disciples and then does that with the 70, then those 2 things are connected, right? And then when Jesus asks Peter, who do people say I am? Well, that's connected to the story in the Transfiguration, and the whole purpose of who is his master and what must he become like, if it is the role of the disciple to become like the master, right? So yeah, I mean, you can see the interactions between the pieces, and Luke does this very consciously, because remember, Luke's coming out of a Greek worldview. He has to wrap his head around the Hebrew understanding of the world, and then so he works really hard on pulling together the educational process that disciples are receiving. So I suppose the question then for us is, how in each of these sections do we embed practice? Like, how do we get people to go and how do we teach like Jesus taught? That is, go out and do this, right? And then come back, maybe not get people to try and raise the dead or something like that, but, like something a little, sort of bits and pieces so that people can, as they say, fail forward,
Yeah, that's a key thing that I think there's a lot of people think, well, we've been taught that you must act out your faith in this way, laying of hands and so on, because you can pray about something, but what you pray is not visible. Whereas when you step out and you pray for somebody in public or in church even, you can see whether there's a result or not. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And therefore, your fear is that you're going to fail. If we can move away from that failure and just do, I think Peter said, at your word, I will do it. If we can get into our brains, into our hearts, that it's We're just being obedient. And the result, while we do the action, the result is not ours. It's not directly related to our actions.
Yeah, and I think Jesus is clear on that. He says, "I only do what I see the Father doing," and in that sense, Jesus is saying, "I'm all in for the plan, right? I'm part of God's redemptive plan, and he understands the clock he's on and all that sort of stuff." The interesting thing about Peter's statement in that setting is that, in a sense, what he's doing is shoving the responsibility for the outcome back on Jesus. So what he's saying is that I don't have the faith for this, but at your word, right? That is, if it fails, this is your problem. Right?
Yeah, well, in a way, that's what he's saying. But yeah,
and I think we often find ourselves in that situation, and we should, right? Because it's the process by which we learn, right? Over time, I think as we get older, and we've been longer in the faith, we're sort of used to God doing weird stuff, right? That you wait, you see one shoe drop and you wait for the other one, right? And it's not unexpected because you get used to what Peter Berger used to call the rumors of transcendence, right? That what looks like to anybody else a natural action or whatever, you just feel the shoe drop, that something's coming, that God is doing something. You might not know what it is, but if you step into it, you're going to be safe. It's going to be okay because it's part of his plan. I think that's what Jesus is trying to teach the disciples overall, is not to know everything. No man knows the hour of the day. Even the Son of Man, it has not been revealed to him, and won't be revealed to him until he ascends to heaven. But what he's trying to get the disciples to understand is that the God who, as he said on the Sermon on the Mount, keeps his eye upon the sparrow, is exactly the God who's asking you to do really difficult things, or things which are made difficult by the way that the world teaches us, to step into those things, right? And you think about our forebears, our grandparents, the things which they did. They went off to World War I. They left their towns and traveled around the world. They were often caught up in famine and poverty and all sorts of things, and yet they pressed ahead. They didn't see it was like someone was oppressing them. It was just the way the world was, and that the only way was to go forward. I've been talking to a lot of people at the university where I'm talking that, and I said, what's changed over the last 10 years? And they said, well, everybody seems to need a safety room now. Everyone needs cotton wool. Everyone needs, to be, you've got to be careful for microaggressions and all sorts of things. Everyone's very anxious all the time. And it's sort of linked, I think, to the fact that we've sort of forgotten that most of history is not like that. The human condition is not like that. So when Jesus goes out and says, go out and heal, you're talking about a culture for which you could die of the simplest things. It's not we live in the post-antibiotic age from the 1940s. Before that, most of the things which happen to us on a weekly or monthly basis could kill us. And lots of people, if you read the story of women during the 19th century, for example, childbirth was a very dangerous thing. And going to hospital was a very dangerous thing. Most people preferred to die at home. Why? Not just because it's more comfortable, but because going to hospital was about 40% more dangerous than just staying at home, because they had no idea about infection, right? So that's very recent, right? That's within 2 lifetimes, right? And yet somehow we've lost all ability to risk, to fail forward, and know that God's going to catch us. And at the same time, people have lost any sense of the providential world in which God is present. So this is a really interesting time to be doing the gospel. It may well be that some of the hard things that are coming our way are precisely what God will use to restore some sense of at least a centurion's faith. But anyway, so treat the whole thing, the 3 chapters, as one thing. Treat it as a discipleship pathway instruction. And don't be afraid to look for interconnections elsewhere in the Bible. That's precisely what Jesus is doing. He's calling on, prophecies from Zechariah. When he gets on the donkey, he's asking people about, who am I? He's doing on the Mount of Transfiguration what Abraham records, or is recorded about Abraham in the book of Genesis. So about the presence of God and the three men and all that sort of stuff. So all these things are echoes of one another. So don't be afraid to reach out and use the whole Bible to interpret the particular things that are happening, why Jesus says the things that he does and why he does the things that he does. Why healing, for example, not sort of supernatural understanding about the operation of something of the cosmos. And that's not the spiritual gift that he gives us, is healing, not this sort of other thing that is basic. And the reason for that partially is the struggles that the disciples have, and which everybody else has, is about the nature of the body and its relationship to the mind, right? That is how we know God, both theoretically and experientially. And for most people, the troubles of the body, which were massive in those days, are really problematic. And so that's a big open door for the gospel if you can solve that. And then demonstrating, the king of this world, the powers of the air, those things which are powerless against God, but at the same time seeking to take dominion over human hearts and minds and spirits, in the long-running rebellion which God is. Jesus, what does Jesus say? I saw Satan fall from heaven. He's telling that story, right? It's the big story that Jesus is participating in, and which he's inviting the disciples into, and he's inviting us into, not the little stories which concern us so much from day to day. Those things look after themselves, basically, if you get the big story right. Okay, so that's more or less the shape of things, I think. They're a wonderful set of passages. It's like almost like anything in the Bible, actually. You just put your finger anywhere and it's amazing. But these three chapters are amazing. I mean, they're just so full of rich stuff. You will enjoy them enormously. And maybe Andrew and Antoinette, all of us can help us think about the practical side.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to work out. What can we do practically?
We've got themes now. I mean, back in the old days, back in the 1980s, the C3 guys used to give themselves sort of like little experiments, like small things, not big things, like, get up in the morning, pray that God will put someone across your path that you can speak about, the gospel to, and then be in expectation for that day, So these are small things. They're not, if it doesn't happen, no harm, no foul, right? Then you can ask yourself why it didn't happen. But you think about small things like that. I think that's the sort of thing that Jesus did across the 3 years, was challenge them to do small things, then bigger things, then bigger things, and then look, here are 5,000 people, feed them. So embedding that in the ministry side, it doesn't have to be you who does it. I think, but I think we have to think about how we do this in a pragmatic fashion. Okay, Andrew, back to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Great overview. I'm really super excited about this series. It's kind of feel like it's a bit of a watershed moment for us. Like, this is exactly where we need to be, and this is where we need to head. And if we don't, we're going to fall backwards, right? Like, this is the next thing. And in some ways, like, the last 6 or 7 years has been leading up to this, right? Which is to get the cycle of discipleship kind of functioning, not just within the people that's there, but also creating, people who make disciples of others. So to me, this is the next logical step, and we've not really come to get grips with it, right? Like we've seen the Great Commission, we've understood it all of our lives, but it's kind of our time now to sort of come to grips with how this works in the Liberty community. And we've seen bad examples in the past of not bad example, didn't things that didn't work, right? And things we know won't work today, but God's still working through us. And so, coming back to this scripture and understanding how Jesus challenged the disciples to step into this. I think this is it's a critical moment, and it's a moment that's necessary. And I feel like, I will be challenged as a speaker as much or more than anyone else to, understand this and sort of live it out, right? Not just to be able to, Mark talked about the theoreticals versus the practicals, but the practicals, right? So yeah, that's exciting.
And Ken's going to do some practical stuff.
Yeah. So we yeah, good point. We talked to Ken about this, after the Sunday message, and when we talked to him earlier, and he said when he's back next year, which I think was maybe February, March, he'd be happy to do some teaching about, practical witness. He said, until people taught him, he never understood how simple this could be. And so we've got that to look forward to as well, right? So, when we come up with these ideas about how we can do these simple things even now, we've also got that to anticipate it as well. So kind of bring it all home. So yes, it's gonna be a good series, but it's gonna be not just one thing, right? It's the disciples come back again to Jesus and learn again and fail and learn. And I know that Ken's talked a lot about that, right? This ability to, this practice of trying and hearing and then making mistakes and working out, what we misheard and correcting that. And that's really what Mark has been describing, right? What Jesus was teaching the disciples, the ability to fail, and everything doesn't need to be right? Maybe that's something we need to sort of break through. When you look at Jesus, he never made a mistake. When you look at these sort of great leaders, these examples that we see in front of us, we see few mistakes. We know make mistakes, but we need to be able to not start at that point, but rather start at the point that where we're at, and wherever we see those opportunities, we take the opportunity, and then we learn. And maybe we fail, but we keep learning. So yeah, it's going to be good. On a sort of minor technical thing, because there's only 5 sermons before the end of the year, I haven't put the roster for February, so that there's more topics than we have on roster. You'll see in Mark's document. So if you find ones later on that you want to speak on, but we don't have a date for it, that's fine. Just let me know, and I'll kind of make a note somewhere so that when we generate the roster for February and March, we'll have you guys allocated on that.
I think I've done 11 topics, but there are actually several more to come. So once my head's clear and I've got a couple of days, I'll go back and fill out a few more. But because it doesn't quite get to the landing point on the 11 we have.
If it's like any other things, we usually go 3 to 6 months. That's
and the other thing, of course, is when you approach the text, you're going to find other stuff, right? And I think we have in the past, like Maria's, 2 sermons on the 1 sermon week. The timetable is just what we do as a group. So, just so I'd like to talk about this. Can we talk it over? And then there'll be space in the roster for that. Yeah.
Mm.
The other thing, and probably from a ministry side, is to think about that learning loop, and that is in the learning loop, the disciples had Jesus to go back to. So the question is, when you challenge somebody to go and do something, and they want to, and they fail, and they want to come back and reflect on it, who do they come to?
Mm.
They might also think about the net.
Mm.
Okay, any last thoughts from anyone else or comments or? Okay. All right. Thank you everyone for your time this evening. It's been, a good session. Thanks, Mark, for all the work you're doing here. We really appreciate both your knowledge, but also sort of your spiritual insights as well, which help to give us a lot more framework than I think we would have the ability without you. And you're kind of crucial to creating this curriculum. It's been it's so helpful for all the speakers, right, to have the framework to then speak in. And I see some of the practice we have here is reflective of what Jesus is doing too, right? Which is you set up a structure and then we have to go out and do it. And sometimes maybe we don't hit the mark, but we keep, and that's how I think the speaking team has sort of grown over time, right? What we're doing.
Yeah, there's not too many weeks where I'm not super impressed by everybody on this call and a few others. I think God's given us a real constructive gift. I think it's bearing fruit. The question is how do we not do this sort of theoretically by adopting other people's ways of approaching it, but how do we do it as Liberty Hill, according to the charism that we've been given? So some of that's the teaching side. Some of that I think is going to be identifying. I know Charles has done this for years. He's like, people will have a question, they'll just sidle up to him and ask the question, then they'll sit down and have a chat to him about it. Doing that deliberately, I think, going forward that's a big question. Some of us are not as young as we were. So. I don't think I've got no worries about where the teaching ministry will go. God's in it. It's a charism of the church. I think I already know who's going to be doing what I'm doing in 20 years' time. But I think not all of us have got experience in, for example, praying for the sick. It'd be great if we identified that and matured that, both from the learning and the teaching side. And not all of us have. I once gave an alpha weekend with a Anglican minister who had a particular thing about casting out demons, and it was an interesting weekend. And believe me, it was well beyond my sort of intellectual understanding of things, but incredibly real at the same time. So that was a church which, in a sense, so you tend to play to your strengths, right? But we're not a one-person band like most churches are. We're a community of expression and teaching. So how are the gifts spread amongst us, and how do they participate in the teaching process? I think that's it's just saying what I said before. That is, somebody goes and tries something and fails. Who do they come back to? I think people naturally sort of know. We don't have to put labels on things, but I think we have to be clear in our own heads. Like if someone comes to me and says, ask me about praying for people, I think I'm having dreams, or I said, go and talk to Antoinette. That's an easy thing to do, right? But in our range of things, how do we, in a sense, preach and teach across the range of those things that Paul talks about in Corinthians or Ephesians? Interesting times for us to think about those things. Okay, yeah, that's me.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Bless you. Have a
Bye.
good rest of
Bye.
the week. See you on Sunday.
See
Bye.
ya.